So I have a friend who was in ranger school, and actually he's a ranger, and now he is in charge of an entire platoon within the military. But one of the big things that I had learned from him is the importance of delegation and the responsibility to give delegation, or rather the responsibility that you need to instill within that person to say, okay, you're in charge of this shit, this is what you're going to do. And I think that's very important, and that can be translated maybe within esports. One of the very famous people that is about responsibility, within our current day and age, is a guy named Jocko Willink, who was a former Navy SEAL, and what he propagates is the idea of responsibility and ownership, and the fact that you need to take ownership of a specific situation in order to handle it the most, I guess, efficient way as possible. And that's something that I've learned from a lot of my military friends is the fact that ownership can actually help you in a lot of different scenarios. So, with that said, let's shift to the corporate world, right? And then we'll kind of de-escalate this to the esports world. But let's go into the corporate world first, which is what is the idea of a manager? Or what is a purpose of a manager? Well, a manager is there to delegate, right? It is to say, this is what you should be working on. Here are your tasks, etc. Now, why is that important? Well, the reason for that being is because you don't want the same person or a couple different people working on the same tasks, right? So you have a list of maybe what needs to be done within the entire company, and so you delegate those tasks to everyone else. It's the same thing as the military, in fact. And so that's why a manager is important, is that they align all the tasks and then they dolly out those tasks to separate different people. Otherwise, if everyone just knew all the tasks that need to be done, then there would be multiple people trying to do the same tasks at once. And so you would have people starting at 0% for the same task, and maybe they don't know that another person in the entire company is associated with that task. So they aren't actually able to share that information of, what they've gathered about that particular task. That's why managers actually exist within entire companies, is to dictate tasks. That's their entire function, actually. But also true is the idea that managers need to communicate exactly what they're doing. Not only because it's important to communicate what each other person below them needs to be doing, because you don't want people to be doing something that is redundant, but also because you need to facilitate exactly what you're doing and what value that you're providing within the entire company. So, for instance, in my modern day and age job, I had made this mistake before. And the fact that I didn't communicate exactly what I was doing for the company to my boss, right? Which is like, he's like in the board of directors and shit like that, right? Like very high up. And if I don't communicate that properly, which I didn't do, then it's going to seem like maybe I'm missing a chunk of my job or my responsibilities of what I'm supposed to do. So not only is it important that you do the responsibilities that are tasked to you, but you need to communicate that you're actually doing that. And so, for instance, I have currently made my company about $6 million in revenue, just alone on the tasks that I've done in terms of the initiatives that I've done and the programs that I've built out. But that doesn't necessarily translate to my boss and maybe what he knows of what I've done. He knows a little bit about what I've done, but he doesn't know like the full extent of maybe the entire processes or the particular projects that I've done. But as I've grown maybe in the corporate world, because I'm not like, to be honest with you guys, I'm not from the corporate world, right? I've grown in like poverty, basically, right? So like, I don't have any education. I'm not college educated at all. But the point being is that as I've seen the corporate world and like the inside of it, it is just as much to complete your work that is important, as well as to communicate what work that you've done. Not only just to sing your own praises, but also to then make it to where no one else that is maybe might be initiated on such a similar project doesn't go over a redundant aspect, because you've already completed that job. So you need to make sure that your superiors know about this, so that you aren't stepping over anyone's toes and you don't have someone doing the same job maybe that you have done. So going to esports, TSM is probably the greatest example of what I would consider micromanaging. I think, they're the greatest example because they're probably the most prominent example, right? Because they're the most like front facing, right? And the fact that TSM Reginald has micromanaged his entire coaching staff for probably the entire existence of what the coaching staff is. Aside from maybe what happened at the tail end with Parth having to take over because of defunct coaches, and then also Bjergsen being a co-owner and also a coach. So like it's kind of up in the air as to whether that was really Reginald just taking hands off, or whether he was forced to take his hands off of that. But the point of that entire debacle is, and of what micromanaging is, and why that phrase or that phraseology is so bad is because that means that you actually lack bad leadership qualities, because that means that you don't trust the people that you instilled the theoretical trust for. Right? You instilled this person that is supposed to be a director of some sort of a particular department. And so that means you don't actually have faith in them enough to make correct decisions. So therefore you have to know every single little thing that they do, which then you should just be doing the job yourself. So that's a bad leadership quality, because you essentially don't entrust your team with a type of responsibility. And like, this goes back to the idea of, what I was talking about with like my military friend is like Jocko Willink, and how this former Navy SEAL guy has instilled the idea of what is responsibility and ownership of a particular problem. And so if you don't allow your crew to have ownership of an entire idea, you strip them of their identity as such, and you strip them of a job. And that's a really bad quality of a leader. You need to allow someone to actually take ownership of their task. And so therefore it makes it more meaningful to them. And so they'll be able to do that task better. Like, that's essentially the ethos of what that Jocko Willink guy was talking about when it comes to entire like ownership or responsibility of an idea or of a task. So I don't think you would be surprised at how respected people are when they own their own mistakes, because when you take this idea of ownership and you take this idea of responsibility, that becomes to where people actually own up to their own mistakes, because they feel like that entire idea of what they took ownership with, or et cetera, or responsibility, that means that they own that shit. That's like part of their being. And so that means that they're probably willing to fess up to certain mistakes or certain different areas which they see the faults in, etc. And so you're probably more able as a leader, above that person, to be able to realize that earlier, because they take entire ownership of that entire process. And so also too, now you can directly point to the person that is responsible to that, because oftentimes when you make it so ambiguous, then the blame constantly gets shifted, right? And so this is maybe goes to the alluding idea of, recently what happened with TSM, to where they're being investigated by a Riot Games third-party lawyer in terms of like verbal abuse from Reginald. And then you have the Wired article that was also released talking about how Reginald has like verbally abused his subordinates, or his managers or people within his company, etc., allegedly, right? So I think it's a very bad idea if you're someone in a higher position, that you don't own up to your mistakes. And you could see that in the statement that was made to Wired, and the fact that Reginald had said that he's very competitive. He expects everyone within his company to be held to a high standard, and that they should be competitive, etc., and that he just wants to win. And this was ignoring the entire idea of his previous faults. And then he later explains that he does have previous faults, etc., etc., but they seem to be separated, and it wasn't well written. That's what I would say. I think the basis of it was it just wasn't well written, and he should have actually combined those two different like ideas or different paragraphs. I believe they were different paragraphs, and he should have combined those ideas to where they seem to be of one entity, so that he could own up to his mistakes while also saying that he's very competitive. But now they just seem like two separate ideas, and that's part of his entire mistake. And so I think that is one recognition to where you could say that's Reginald not owning up to his own mistakes, and the fact that he's in a part of leadership and everyone else below him is actually a subordinate to him. So he should actually own up to all of that shit. So I think the biggest thing when it comes to leadership itself and the whole grandiose idea, especially within esports, is you need to lay out your goals, especially if you're a CEO. If you're anyone, actually, if you're anyone below a CEO, I think that's even more important. Is you need to lay out your goals of what you're trying to accomplish to the CEO, to the company itself. You need to align and say, I can accomplish this for your company. This is what I'm willing to do. And, maybe this is like what I'm willing to get paid for. And there's a great author. His name is Chris Voss. He's a former FBI like hostage rescue guy, and like negotiator. And he has a book called Never Split the Difference, and it talks about the art of negotiating and the fact that essentially you don't want to make it to where you and maybe your employer or someone comes on like this weird even ground to where both of you are dissatisfied. Like, and that's what's called like splitting the difference, is that both of you are dissatisfied, and you want to come to an agreement to where you're benefiting that person and that person is benefiting you. And you don't want to feel like you as a employee that you're being taken advantage of. As well too, as the employer, you don't want them to feel like they're being taken advantage of. And so this comes into like the whole esports mold, and the fact that this seems like it's happening on a regular basis. So, and I think also too, the problem with this is that people aren't being held accountable for the tasks that maybe that they need to do. And so if as an organization, maybe you should develop a task list to say, these are your tasks. This is exactly what I want you to do. And I think part of that actually is the hiring process, and the fact that the people that are in charge within these entire organizations don't actually know what they want. So if you don't know what you want, then how are you going to hire someone to where they know exactly what they're supposed to do? That's a fucked up premise in and of itself. You know, I like to maybe make the comparison to that goals should actually be defined. This is something that Jordan Peterson has said within his, I think, 12 Rules for Life or some shit. I haven't read the book, but I bought it. And I know I'm going to get shit for that anyways, but fuck you. But it's that, yeah, goals should be defined. And the fact that when you define a goal, it gives it a certain power. It gives it a certain structure to where now it's like, fuck, now since I defined the goal, I kind of have to complete it. And that's what every organization or every company should strive to do, is make someone put out their goals of what they're trying to accomplish. And if you can give that goal to someone else, even better. They don't even have to think about the goal that they need to accomplish, which sometimes in, you know, a lower level job, they don't actually know what their goal is supposed to be. So you have to give that for them, which is fine. So I think all in all, owners have a hard time letting all of the small stuff go, of letting all of the nitty gritty of what maybe someone needs to accomplish within, you know, their entire job. I think that's something, as you go higher and higher up in the ranks of management and whatnot, you need to let all of that small shit go down, but you still need to hold that person accountable to larger ideas or larger prospects of what it is to be in part in that organization. But it's your responsibility actually to flesh that out. And maybe if the person is smart, they should help you realize that. But just because you don't understand, it doesn't mean you need to concern yourself with it, right? So if you're someone at the higher end of a level of an organization, just because you don't understand the particular nitty-gritty of what someone is doing, although it does help, and that's maybe how you don't have your company run away from itself, and so you could hold everyone accountable to the most, I guess, minute aspect. That would be the preferable thing, but you're probably going to drive yourself insane if you try and do that. So that's why you try and hire competent people. So all in all, the appearance of authority goes a very long way when it comes to esports, when it comes to business, etc. But also too, when it comes to just management and hierarchy, etc. Don't take jobs from other people as well. That I think that should also be a understood rule. And I think that's misunderstood from a lot of managers. And the fact that essentially, if you're trying to micromanage people, and if you take responsibility or you take jobs from them, then that makes it to where they feel like their job is worthless, which I feel like is happening in a lot of choice esports organizations. And so therefore, you essentially degrade the lack of buy-in from that particular person within that particular job. So leadership doesn't work without a hierarchy. And if the hierarchy is not able to establish what they want from the people below them, then the hierarchy actually doesn't work, because now you're just having the blind lead the blind, essentially. And so this is what I see a lot rampant within esports, whether that be within the current TSM, situation or whatnot. But that's a really dark path to go down, and essentially that is a path of like destruction, essentially. So all in all, yes, you need to be able to dole out responsibility accordingly, and with that, you need to be able to, I guess, let go of the things that need to be, let go of, right, to other people that may be more capable of doing it, but also people to where you just don't have the time in order to deal with that little bullshit. And so you have to be willing to let go of that. And I think that's actually a sign of a
a very good and competent leader.